Welcome to Net Automate. In this video, we will be going over the lab for the basics of Python. I've created 3 tasks and we'll go over each one. As you can see, the details of the task are written as a Python comment. Keep in mind that since this is a comment, we can write whatever we want and it will not affect the actual execution or the outcome of running the code. Okay, so the task asks us to create 2 variables which are named number1 and number2. Set the value of number1 to 5 and the value of number2 to 7. Okay, so I'll create a variable called number1 and I will set its value to 5. I'll do the same for number2 and just say number2 equals 7. Keep in mind that since number1 and number2 are whole integers without any decimal point, that means that number1 and number2 are of the integer data type. Second step is to create a third variable called result and set it so that it is the result of multiplying number1 and number2. Okay, so I'll just create a third variable, call it or just call it result, and that will be number1 times number2. Okay, so I created this variable. Now I'm supposed to print the variable result. So let me do that. Print result. Let me try to run this code, clear this output and run the code. Let's just say Python task1.py. As you can see, I got 35, which is the result of multiplying 5 and 7. Now, let me go ahead and go to task 2. Okay, so the task is asking me to create a variable called current year and another variable called birth year. Both variables should be taken from the user as inputs. Okay, so I'll have 2 variables and I'm not gonna explicitly set their value. I'm gonna ask the user to give me those values. So we'll say current underscore year equals and then input, and we'll just ask the user enter the current year. Okay, so as we mentioned, the input function is used to take input from the user, and this is the prompt that the user will see. Keep in mind that this prompt is a string. That's why it's inside single quotes. You could have used double quotes, that would have worked too. Birth year, so we'll create the second variable. Birth year is input, and then we'll say enter your birth year or the year you were born in, whatever. As long as they get a nice prompt, doesn't really matter. Okay, so we finished the first part. Second part is asking me to calculate the age of the user based on the 2 inputs and store it in a variable named age. Okay, so I'll say age equals, and to calculate the age, it's just the current year minus the birth year. Obviously, this doesn't take into account the current month, but that's okay. This is a very simple program. Okay, I've calculated the age. Now what I want to do is print out the age of the user on the console. So we'll just say print age. I'll run the task, or I'll run the Python file. Okay, so enter the current year. I'll just say it's 2024. The birth year is 2000, and I get an error. Can you try and guess why I got this error? The thing is, current year and birth year, even though I entered these values, they're actually being treated as strings. They're not integers. The reason why is the input function will always return a string. If you look here, it says that the current year is a string. However, if I were to wrap this inside the integer function, I'll basically convert this string to an integer. Now, if you look here, it says that current year became an integer. I'll do the same for the second variable. And the current year minus the birth year now will be an integer minus an integer, and that'll give me an integer, which is age. If I were to run this again, let me clear this, run it again. I'll enter the current year as 2024. The birth year is 2000, and I get 24. Which is what I expected. Now there is a way to to print out the variable and make the output look much nicer. We haven't learned this yet in the lecture. We'll learn more about this in the next video, but basically we could use what is known as an F string, and inside that we can add whatever string we want. For example, the age of the user is, and then inside curly braces we can add whatever variable we want. So in this case I'll add age. Run it again. This time I'll enter 2024 and the year is, let's say, 2002. So I got the age of the user is 22. This is much nicer compared to just printing out the variable. We'll learn more about F strings in the next video. So if you don't get it, don't worry too much about it. Task 3 is actually a network related task where basically I will connect to a Cisco IOS XR device and I will send the command show IP route to retrieve routing information and print that on the screen. Keep in mind that what I'm using here is the always on sandbox that Cisco provides, but I have heard that that will be replaced with reservable sandboxes, so this may not work for you. You may need to reuse the reservable sandbox or any network device that you can connect to. Right, for example, you could use a Cisco IOS XE router, just choose the correct device type. The host should be the IP address or the host name of your device, and you should issue the correct command. Now you might be confused about what you're seeing here. What I'm using here is what is known as the NetMiko module. NetMiko is a Python module, basically a tool that will help me to connect to devices via SSH. Don't worry too much about it. It's actually not on the exam, and it's not our focus here. Our focus is to fix this piece of code. As you can see, this piece of code is supposed to retrieve routing information. However, I'm not able to connect to the device because the username and password are not defined. So our task here is to ask the user to enter the username and password. So how do we do that? Let's create two variables. We'll just say username equals, and we'll set that to the input function, and we'll say enter your username. Or we'll keep it simpler and just say username. So the user will see that, and then we'll enter the password. Password equals input password. So very simple. Keep in mind that I'm not using the integer function here because I want to keep the username and password as a string, right? So I want to keep it that way. Now, if I were to run this code, and keep in mind that if you run this code, you might get an error if you don't have the NetMiko module installed. The way you can install it is you can just use pip install and then NetMiko. You can either use pip or pip3, really depends on which version of Python you have. I think I'm using pip3 here. So yeah, it says requirement already satisfied because I already have it installed. If not, you can just download NetMiko if you want to test this. But again, NetMiko is not on the exam. It's not on the blueprint or anything. So don't worry too much about it if you're not able to get this to work. But let's run the code. Python task3.py. The username, I'll just use admin, and the password, this is the password, I'll just copy and paste it. Okay, should be connected now. It's taking some time. Okay, here we go. As you can see, we connected to the device, and this is the output of the show IP route command, right? So again, to fix the problem that we had, we just had to create variables for the username and password. Everything else was done for us. Don't worry too much about it again for now. We will cover modules in more details, and we'll have more examples with the NetMiko module as well as other modules. Okay. That was it for this lab. We're not doing much because we just covered the basics. In the next video, we'll learn more about conditionals and we'll build smarter applications. So thanks for watching and see you then.